I met Jillian on one of those nights that's either the start of something amazing or a disaster waiting to happen. My buddies and I were out celebrating a friend's promotion. I'd never been the type to look for romance in crowded bars, but there she was, standing near the jukebox, talking with a couple of her friends, laughing like she owned the room. Blonde curls, blue eyes, the whole cliché, and still, something about her was different. She felt like a force that pulled you in. We struck up a conversation, and before I knew it, the hours slipped by. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only one in the room. We talked about everything from favorite movies to family quirks. I told her about my close-knit but chaotic family, and she told me about her travels and how she never thought she'd settle down in a small town like ours. After that, we were inseparable. Everything about her felt easy and exciting at the same time, like she just knew how to keep things fresh. Within months, we were head over heels, and I was ready to marry her. My family thought I was crazy for rushing into it, but I'd never been sure about anything in my life. The wedding wasn't huge, just close friends and family, but it was perfect. I remember thinking as she walked down the aisle that life couldn't get any better. Little did I know what was coming, or who. We had a few great years of marriage, and everything felt solid, like we had this unbreakable connection. But it turns out, some ghosts from the past don't stay buried. Looking back, maybe there were signs. Or maybe I just wanted to believe we'd keep that happiness forever. I don't know. What I do know is that everything changed the night of her high school reunion. Jillian wasn't exactly eager about the reunion at first. She said high school was behind her and that she wasn't dying to see anyone, but the invites from old friends kept piling up. Eventually, she decided we'd go. Just for a couple hours, she'd said, with that easygoing smile. I didn't think much of it. I figured it'd be fun, maybe a little boring but harmless. So we went. The night started off as expected, awkward small talk with people she hadn't seen in years, some guy who'd clearly peeked back in high school going on about the glory days, you know, the usual. I didn't know anyone there, so I just tried to stick by her and be supportive, while secretly hoping we'd get out of there sooner rather than later. And then she saw him. I didn't know much about him other than that he'd been her high school boyfriend, but the way she reacted, it was like he was someone she'd only just put down, like a favorite book she still had dog-eared for later. They hugged and I swear I saw a spark. Something I hadn't seen in her eyes before. The whole room fell away for her and it was just him. Of course, I didn't think it was anything serious then. I even made a joke about her old high school flame. She laughed it off, gave me a quick kiss and said, "Oh please." That was a lifetime ago. But as the night went on, I noticed she kept glancing his way, finding excuses to laugh a little too loud at things he said, and they kept accidentally ending up in each other's conversations. After we got home, I brushed it off. I told myself it was just old memories. But part of me couldn't shake that feeling that something was wrong, something just off. Still, I trusted her. She was my wife. And back then, I'd never have believed she'd betray me. After the reunion, things felt different. Not right away. Jillian was still herself, still laughing at my dumb jokes and bringing me coffee in the mornings. But gradually, I started to notice little changes. Nothing huge, just things that added up in a way I couldn't ignore. She was on her phone more. When I'd ask her about it, she'd shrug and say it was work or a friend from college. But she'd lock her phone as soon as I walked into the room, something she never used to do. Or I'd hear her laughing at some message and when I asked what was funny, she'd just say, "Oh, nothing." And maybe it was nothing. I tried to tell myself that. Then she started going out more. She suddenly needed me time or girl nights that she hadn't needed before. I'd watch her get dressed up, more effort than usual, her phone buzzing like crazy, and every time, I told myself I was imagining things. She was my wife and I trusted her. But the way she'd pull away from me in bed or dodge my hugs, saying she was tired or stressed, it ate at me. Like I was slowly becoming invisible. One night, she came home late, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I asked, half joking, "So, how's Troy doing?" She stiffened, just for a second, then laughed it off, saying, "Oh please. Troy's old news." She kissed me on the cheek, called me silly and went to bed. And yet, that unease was there. I was starting to feel like a stranger in my own home, watching her slip further away each day. But I still wasn't ready to admit that she might be lying to me. Because who wants to admit that? So I let it go, until the day I couldn't ignore it anymore. I remember every second of that night, like a tape that keeps rewinding in my head. Jillian was supposed to meet up with friends for dinner. She'd been doing that more often lately. Suddenly she had all these dinners, coffee catch-ups, nights out that hadn't been part of her life before. This time, though, something felt off from the start. She barely looked at me when she left, tossing out a quick, "Don't wait up," as she rushed out the door. I tried to brush it off, convince myself that I was overthinking things. But something in my gut wouldn't settle down. I sat there on the couch for hours, half watching some late-night TV rerun but mostly staring at the door, hoping any minute now she'd walk back in and everything would feel normal again. Midnight came and went. I told myself she was probably just enjoying herself and lost track of time. By 1 a.m., that excuse felt thin, but I held on to it anyway. At 2, I was pacing the room, fighting the urge to call her and demand to know where she was. Finally, a little after 3, I heard her key turn in the lock. She stepped in quietly, like she was hoping I'd already be asleep, her hair a little messy, her cheeks flushed. She froze when she saw me sitting there. She looked surprised, but I saw something else, too. A flash of guilt, maybe, or panic. Something she couldn't hide fast enough. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice high-pitched, a bit too casual. "Yeah." "Couldn't sleep," I said, keeping my eyes on her. "How was your night?" "Oh, you know, same old," she muttered, avoiding my gaze as she started walking toward the bathroom. But something didn't feel right, so I followed her, watching as she fumbled with her makeup bag, like she was looking for an excuse to stay in there longer. And that's when I saw it, a smear of lipstick on her collar. Bright red, not her color. I'd seen her wear shades of pink and peach, but never that deep red. "Jillian," I said, my voice firmer than I'd planned, "what's going on?" She didn't turn around. She just stood there, stiff, her shoulders tensing up as if she'd been waiting for this question. Finally, after what felt like forever, she faced me, trying to give me one of those dismissive smiles. "What do you mean? You're coming home at 3 a.m., there's lipstick on your collar, and you've been acting different for weeks. Are you seeing someone?" At first, she tried to laugh it off, but it came out shaky. "Oh, come on. You're being paranoid." "Am I?" I stepped closer, looking her straight in the eyes. "Just tell me the truth, Jillian." For a moment, I saw her jaw tighten, like she was weighing her options, trying to decide if she could keep lying or if she should just get it over with. Then her shoulders slumped and her face fell. That's when I knew I was about to hear the truth, but I could already feel it in my gut. "It's not what you think," she started, which only made me angrier because it sounded so rehearsed, like she was ready to throw excuses at me before I could even react. She took a deep breath and finally admitted, "I've been seeing someone. Just someone from my past." "Troy," I said, the name tasting bitter as it left my mouth. I didn't even know I'd been holding on to that suspicion until I said it out loud. She nodded, eyes cast downward. "It wasn't supposed to happen, okay? We just reconnected at the reunion and what? It just happened?" I couldn't help the sarcasm in my voice, the anger bubbling up as I struggled to keep it in check. "You tripped and fell into his arms?" She flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she looked at me with this helpless, almost pleading expression. "I didn't plan this, all right? I never meant for it to go so far." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" I asked, my voice coming out louder than I intended. "You didn't mean for it to happen, but you kept going back. You kept lying to me." She went quiet, biting her lip, looking anywhere but at me. I took a deep breath, trying to keep myself calm, trying to make sense of it all. But one question kept gnawing at me, eating me alive from the inside. "Do you love him?" I finally asked, almost whispering, not sure if I even wanted to hear the answer. She didn't respond right away, and that silence was enough. I knew. Her hesitation told me everything. Eventually, she managed to choke out, "I don't know. I just know that it's different. What I feel with him is different." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and suddenly it was hard to breathe. Here was the woman I'd thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, the woman who'd promised me forever, telling me that what we had wasn't enough for her. I stood there, staring at her, feeling the weight of her betrayal settle in, heavy and suffocating. She kept saying she was sorry, like it would erase what she'd done, like it would somehow make it hurt less. But those words, they didn't mean a thing anymore. She'd made her choice, even if she couldn't say it out loud. And in that moment, I realized I was looking at a stranger. After that night, things went from bad to worse. Jillian slept in the guest room, and we barely spoke. Our home felt like a war zone. Silent, tense, with this constant pressure building, like any word might set off an explosion. I wanted answers, but part of me was too afraid to ask. I was terrified that if she spoke, she'd confirm my worst fears. And yet, every day, I hoped she'd come to me, say it was all a mistake, that she'd choose us. But that moment never came. Instead, she became more distant. When she was home, she was a ghost, moving through the house like she was barely there. I'd catch her staring at her phone, lost in thought, sometimes with this faint smile on her lips. And I knew, without even needing to ask, that she was thinking about him. Troy had become this shadow between us, one I couldn't chase away. One Saturday, after another night of silence, I tried to confront her. I wanted to know if there was still anything left between us, anything worth fighting for. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, not even noticing me walk in. I stood there for a second, watching her, trying to remember the woman I married and wondering if she was still in there somewhere. "Jillian," I said, and she looked up, startled, her face immediately guarded. "Yeah," she replied, her tone defensive, like she was already bracing for a fight. I took a breath, steadying myself. "Are you still talking to him?" She didn't answer right away, just stared at me, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite read. Then finally she sighed and said, "Yes." Just like that. One word that shattered whatever was left of my hope. I felt a mix of anger and helplessness rise up, but I pushed it down. "So, what are you planning to do?" I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. "Are you leaving?" She glanced away, fiddling with her phone. "I don't know, okay? I need time to figure things out." "Figure things out?" I repeated, feeling the sting of those words. "We're married, Jillian. I'm your husband. We've got a life together, a life you promised me, and you're telling me you need time to decide if that's what you want." She looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw real frustration in her eyes. "I know what I promised, but things changed. People change. I can't help how I feel." Her words hit hard, each one feeling like a deliberate blow. I wanted to argue, to scream, to beg her to see reason. But there was something in her eyes, something final, that told me nothing I said would change anything. After a long, painful silence, I finally asked, "Do you love him?" She hesitated, then nodded, almost reluctantly. "I think yes." That was it. The last nail in the coffin of our marriage, sealing away whatever dreams I'd held onto. I left the room, unable to look at her, feeling hollow, like I'd lost everything that mattered. Because I had. Not long after that conversation, Jillian moved out. She said it was just for a while, that she needed space to clear her head and figure things out. I knew better. Deep down, I knew it was the end, but there was still a part of me clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, she'd come back. The day she left, I watched her pack. She barely looked at me, focused on her suitcase, picking clothes, and a few personal things like she was going on some casual trip instead of walking out on our life together. I stood there, frozen, feeling like an outsider in my own home. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Troy's letting me stay at his place," she said quietly, like she was afraid to admit it out loud. But she didn't look ashamed. She looked almost resolved. That was all it took to make the reality set in. This wasn't just a break, and it wasn't just some fling. She was walking out on our marriage to go back to a guy she hadn't seen since high school, and somehow, I'd lost to him. There was no way to make sense of it. When she was done packing, she finally looked up at me. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said softly, as if that would somehow make it better. "Yeah, well, you did," I replied, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "You hurt me, Jillian. You hurt us." She looked away, like she couldn't stand the weight of my gaze. "I'm sorry," she murmured, but I could tell she didn't really know what she was apologizing for. She'd already made up her mind. In her head, this was done. I stood by the door as she walked out, gripping the handle so hard my knuckles turned white. She didn't look back, just climbed into her car, gave a small wave, and drove off. And that was it. Jillian was gone. 4 days afterward, I felt like a ghost in my own life. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of her, our wedding photo on the shelf, her favorite coffee mug in the kitchen, the half-empty closet in our bedroom. I tried to go about my routine, but everything felt empty, meaningless. I'd come home from work to a silent, dark house, the weight of her absence settling in every corner. At night, I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd gone from promising forever to this. I kept replaying the last few months, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, some moment I'd missed that could have changed the outcome. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't have mattered. She'd made her choice long before I ever knew there was a choice to be made. Days turned into weeks, and the silence stretched on, wrapping around me like a thick fog. The realization hit me slowly, painfully, that Jillian wasn't coming back. The first weeks without Jillian felt like I was living someone else's life, like I'd been dropped into this strange reality where everything looked the same but felt hollow. I tried to keep it together at work, but the minute I came home, the emptiness hit me all over again. I'd stare at the spot on the couch where she used to sit, curl up with a book, or sit across the table where we'd eat dinner and talk about our day. Now it was just me eating in silence, trying not to think too much. I'd get calls from friends and family checking in, their voices cautious, gentle, like they were afraid I'd break if they said the wrong thing. I didn't tell them the full story. I didn't want to talk about Troy or admit how blindsided I felt. All they knew was that Jillian left, and most of them had the decency not to pry. Still, I could hear the questions hiding behind their words. That's "how are you holding up?" and "do you want to talk about it?" But I didn't want to talk. I just wanted to get through each day without falling apart. One night, maybe a month after she left, I was sitting alone in the kitchen, drinking a beer and staring at our wedding photo. I couldn't bring myself to take it down, even though every time I looked at it, it felt like a punch to the gut. In that picture, we looked so happy, so sure of each other, like nothing could come between us. I wanted to reach into the frame, grab that younger version of myself, and warn him not to get too comfortable. Tell him that nothing lasts forever. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed my phone and called her. I just needed to hear her voice. Maybe I wanted her to admit she'd made a mistake or tell me she missed me, that she was coming back. But when she picked up, she sounded cold, almost distant. Like I was just some acquaintance she hadn't talked to in years. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding weaker than I wanted it to. "How are you?" She hesitated. "Fine. How are you?" I could hear Troy's voice in the background, faint but unmistakable. That hit me like a slap in the face, and I felt this wave of anger and hurt rise up. "So, you're really with him, huh? You're actually living with him?" "Look," she said, her tone defensive, I didn't want it to happen like this. "But yes, I'm with Troy. This is where I'm supposed to be." Her words were like knives. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to keep my voice steady. "So that's it? After everything, you're just done with us?" "I didn't plan this," she repeated, sounding frustrated, like she was tired of defending herself. I wasn't happy, okay? I needed something different, something real." "Real?" I scoffed. "We were real, Jillian. What we had was real." She went quiet for a second, and for a moment, I thought maybe she'd reconsider, that maybe there was still a part of her that cared. But then she sighed, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, almost regretful. "I'm sorry. I really am. But I have to go." And with that, she hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone in disbelief, feeling the weight of her words sink in. She had made her choice, and no amount of pleading or hoping was going to change that. Whatever we had, it was over. That night, I took down our wedding photo. Taking down the wedding photo was like closing a door I'd left cracked open. Once it was gone, I had to accept that she was, too. Jillian was off living a new life with Troy, and no matter how many times I turned it over in my mind, There was no going back. But accepting that was one thing. Moving forward was another. The days were a blur of just getting by, trying to keep busy so I wouldn't spiral. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking I should tell Jillian something funny that happened at work or make her favorite dinner on Fridays, but the memories just reminded me she wasn't here anymore. After a few months, my family started nudging me to get back out there, to meet new people. My sister practically shoved me into going out with her and her husband a few times, introducing me to their friends, but it felt forced. I'd smile and make small talk, but it was all surface level, nothing that felt like it could fill the void. Then one evening, they dragged me to this little jazz bar downtown. I was half listening to the music, trying to look interested in a conversation, when I noticed her. She was sitting at the end of the bar, chatting with the bartender, laughing in this way that felt genuine, like she was completely in the moment. Dark hair, bright smile, a kind of warmth that seemed to fill up the space around her. Her name was Rebecca. I don't know what came over me, but I walked over, introduced myself, and next thing I knew, we were talking. Really talking, in a way I hadn't done with anyone in a long time. She told me about her work as a teacher, how she loved reading and spent her weekends hiking with friends. She was funny, down-to-earth, easy to be around. And for the first time since Jillian left, I felt something other than hurt. I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was life beyond what I'd lost. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks, we started hanging out. At first, I was hesitant, trying not to get ahead of myself, but with Rebecca, everything felt different. She didn't push, didn't expect anything from me. She just wanted to know me, flaws and all. One night, after we'd been seeing each other for a few months, we were sitting in my living room, sharing a bottle of wine, when I finally opened up about Jillian. I told her about the affair, the betrayal, and how I'd spent the last year feeling like I was piecing myself back together. Rebecca just listened, no judgment, no pity, just this understanding look in her eyes. When I finished, she reached over, took my hand and said, "You've been through hell, but you made it. You deserve to be happy again." And in that moment, I believed her. Slowly, Rebecca became my anchor. She showed me how to laugh again, to look forward to things. We took things slow, but eventually, our lives started blending together naturally, like we were meant to find each other in the aftermath of everything. And for the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was really living again. With Rebecca, life felt like it was finally opening up again. She had this way of making everything seem lighter, like even the worst parts of my past didn't carry as much weight when she was around. I'd never expected to find someone like her, not after everything that happened, but there she was, showing me every day what real love looked like. As the months rolled on, Rebecca and I grew closer. We started spending weekends together, planning trips, making our own little traditions. She'd bring me coffee every Sunday morning, insisting on making it just right with a bit too much sugar. I'd complain, but it made me laugh every time, and soon it became our thing. She brought this warmth and sense of humor into my life that I hadn't even realized I was missing. My family noticed the change in me. My mom, who had watched me struggle through the worst of it, pulled me aside one day. "You look happy, really happy," she said, a smile in her voice. "Rebecca's good for you, isn't she?" "Yeah, she is," I replied, and saying it out loud made it feel even more real. For the first time, I wasn't haunted by what Jillian had done or the memories of how things used to be. I was building something new, something solid. Not long after, Rebecca and I decided to move in together. We rented a little house on the edge of town, with a backyard big enough for her to plant a garden and for us to have people over on weekends. It was modest, nothing fancy, but it felt like home from day one. She spent hours picking out curtains and arranging bookshelves, while I fixed up the garage and set up a barbecue pit. We laughed more than we argued, and even when we disagreed, it felt like we were on the same team, working toward the same future. As time passed, talk of marriage came up naturally. One night over dinner, I looked at her, really looked at her, and I knew without a doubt that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. I didn't need some grand gesture or big speech. I just took her hand and said, "Rebecca, would you marry me?" Her eyes filled with happy tears, And she smiled that same warm smile that had pulled me in from the start. "Yes," she whispered, barely able to get the word out. "Yes, 100 times, yes." Our wedding wasn't elaborate, just close family and friends, a simple ceremony in a small chapel in town. My sister was there, crying in the front row, and even my mom got a little teary-eyed. And there was Rebecca, standing there in a simple dress, radiating joy. When we exchanged our vows, I felt this overwhelming sense of peace, like all the pieces of my life had finally fallen into place. I knew Jillian was long gone, but I realized then that I wasn't just moving on from her, I was moving forward with Rebecca, building a life that was ours alone, untouched by the past. The things Jillian had broken, Rebecca had somehow helped me rebuild. From that day on, Rebecca and I focused on building a family of our own. We talked about having kids, about the kind of parents we wanted to be, the kind of home we wanted to give them. And for the first time, I could actually picture a future where I was happy, fulfilled. I could see us growing old together, surrounded by the life we'd made. Life with Rebecca felt like a fresh start, one where I could finally leave the past behind. After we got married, we settled into our new routine, adding little traditions that made our house feel like home. Sunday mornings were sacred, spent reading the paper over breakfast, and Friday nights turned into movie marathons with popcorn that Rebecca always managed to burn just a little. A year after the wedding, we welcomed our first child, a beautiful baby girl we named Ella. Holding her for the first time, I felt this incredible wave of love and responsibility, like everything I'd been through, all the heartbreak and healing, had led to this moment. Rebecca was a natural as a mom, calm and gentle, and somehow managing to make everything look easy. I was in awe of her, grateful in a way I couldn't put into words. Our family grew over the years. We had 2 more kids, a boy named Lucas and another girl, Grace, who was the spitting image of Rebecca. Life became busy and loud, filled with the chaos of raising 3 kids, school projects, soccer games, piano recitals. Our house was always filled with the sounds of laughter and the occasional argument over whose turn it was to pick the movie for family night. I cherished those moments, every single one. They were messy and imperfect but real, solid. Looking back, it was strange to think of how different things had turned out from what I'd once imagined. I had loved Jillian, or at least I thought I had, but with Rebecca, I learned what real, lasting love looked like. She showed me a love that didn't falter or fade, one that stood strong through all of life's ups and downs. She loved me through my past, through the hurt, through the scars, and built something new with me, a family that was ours, that no one could take away. And as our kids grew, I realized that I was doing all the things I'd once only dreamed of, teaching Lucas how to throw a baseball, reading Ella's favorite bedtime stories, cheering Grace on at her ballet recitals. I was living the life I thought I'd lost when Jillian walked out, and it was even better than I'd imagined back then. Some nights, after the kids were asleep, Rebecca and I would sit on the porch with a glass of wine, just talking. She'd lay her head on my shoulder, and we'd watch the stars, saying nothing at all sometimes, just grateful for what we had. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and we'd built it together. I'd look at her and feel this warmth in my chest, knowing that she'd given me a second chance, that somehow, against all odds, I'd found happiness again. Life was good, and I was thankful for every day of it. So, here I am, years after all the pain and heartbreak that came with Jillian leaving me, writing this out in the hopes that maybe someone out there will find some comfort or hope in my story. Jillian was my first love, and for a long time, I thought she'd be my last. When she left, it felt like my whole world had collapsed. I spent months, maybe years, trying to figure out what went wrong, replaying every memory, every fight, every moment I thought was solid between us. I kept asking myself if there was something I could have done differently, if I could have been someone who'd have been enough for her. I tortured myself, thinking I'd never find anyone like her again. But, honestly, losing her turned out to be one of the best things that could have happened to me. It forced me to face parts of myself I'd been ignoring, and eventually, it gave me the space to find someone better. Not better in some shallow way, but better in a way that brought me back to life. Rebecca walked into my life just when I'd given up hope. She showed me that there was love after loss and that real love didn't feel like a roller coaster. It was calm, steady, and full of laughter. We built a life together that I never could have imagined back when I thought everything was over. We raised 3 amazing kids who are my whole world now. I went from thinking I'd spend the rest of my life wondering, what if, to realizing that what I have now was meant to be. Rebecca taught me that heartbreak doesn't define you unless you let it, and that you can choose happiness again, even after the worst kind of betrayal. So, to anyone who's going through that kind of pain, who feels lost or broken, hang in there. There's life on the other side of it, a whole future that might be waiting just out of sight. It doesn't happen overnight, and some days feel harder than others. But one day, if you keep pushing forward, you'll look around and realize you've made it. You're okay again. And maybe, just maybe, you're even better than you were before. Thanks for listening. And if you're out there feeling like I was back then, know that you're not alone, and you're stronger than you think.